Well, hello, everyone. I'm Brian Binder, Senior Director on the Innovation and Growth team. With us today is Simon, our illustrious EVP of Innovation and Growth.
I'm very excited to be sitting down with Brian to talk about the realities and the potential outcomes and do a little bit of forecasting or trying to put on our oracle hats as to what does this mean when it comes to the future of tracking and everything related to the Google third-party cookie non-deprecation announcement.
So, based off of that really was the topic that was making news this week. What was your initial take on it? And just walk us through a little bit about what the overarching overview was.
Yeah, I think that it's important to frame up the announcement within the guardrails that it was stated. I've seen some publications say, hey, Google has announced a reversal of their policy. There is a little bit of truth to that in the sense that what Google has said is they will not be deprecating third party cookies from within Chrome. The actual announcement, though, is I think is a little bit broader, where they've said we're not going to be deprecating cookies, but we are going to be providing the option for informed consent to users so they can opt out of third-party cookies. And in conjunction with that, they're also going to continue their work on the privacy sandbox proposal. So when we talk about privacy sandbox, what we're talking about here are the protected audience API. So essentially the replacement for remarketing capabilities, and the topics API, or essentially the contextual targeting component of the privacy sandbox. So those are the two big solutions that Google has on the table at this moment in time. Those will still exist into the future. Those will be available to DSPs and other to publishers to utilize for their ad targeting. As we saw the announcement come out, it wasn't that surprising, honestly, that they have come with this announcement, because back in April, the UK Competition and Markets Authority, or the UK CMA, essentially they published their quarterly report, and this has been going on for several years now. They published their quarterly report that essentially put Google in between a bit of a rock and a hard place. There was an insoluble tension between privacy and competition, and I think that has been one of the big narratives throughout this entire journey, is that Google wants to make this move that is ultimately in the name of privacy, right? The deprecation of third-party cookies. But in conjunction with that, they also want to essentially snub out the core element of addressability that exists across the open web. For what it's worth, they are the last ones to do this, right? So Safari has already deprecated third-party cookies. Firefox already deprecated third-party cookies. Both of those browsers have been going for years without third-party cookies. Chrome was the last one here. And as they came to the table with this announcement, it made sense. I only saw that they had two options. One was to bring in an independent regulatory body to oversee Chrome, which I don't think they were going to do. It's very complicated. Even with UID, I think Trade Desk tried to do that and then it reverted back to them. It's very hard to do that. So that wasn't really an option. And then the second one, put the onus on the user. That almost seems like a no-brainer. It almost seems like we should have seen this coming as the most likely outcome here of how do we find this middle ground? And critically, how does Google take the onus of responsibility off of them in this process? That's really how I was thinking about this at the moment when it came out. But Brian, I'd love your thoughts. What came to mind for you?
Honestly, for me, when the announcement came out, I wasn't too shocked or surprised, just for the reason that you were just mentioning. This has been a conversation that's been going on for quite some time, and there's a lot of nuance with the rollout of cookie deprecation. But for me, when I saw the news and I saw that they were going to put the onus more on the user, I initially it triggered me to think Apple, ATT. It's exactly how Apple rolled it out. And I was just thinking, it
Yeah.
seems like a very logical place to go, which takes a little bit of the burden off of Google and allows the user to really have that control. Maybe they want to have that user experience that it's based off of cookies. Maybe they don't, but at least the option is given back to the user and not necessarily dictated by the company.
Which, look, I think there's a good PR play there in the optics that we're saying we're giving this control to the user. At the end of the day, though, I think it really is about Google removing the onus from themselves and being able to push this onto the user and say, look, the users are the ones opting out. Because I do think what's interesting about that, and I want to address the ATT piece, but what's interesting is you can already opt out of third-party cookies in Chrome. In fact, I think I saw a study recently that said about 30 or 40% of users in Chrome have already opted out of third-party cookies, which is an interesting signal, although similar to ATT, it's not too different from the fact that prior to the app tracking transparency push from Apple, they already had a setting on iOS devices that said opt out of personalized advertising. And for a lot of folks who'd already toggled that on when ATT came around, that meant that they didn't even get the prompt in the app to say, would you like to opt out of tracking? They were just automatically opted out. But I do think this brings up the really interesting piece of this is how is this opt-out mechanism going to work? Because we're not talking about the deprecation of third-party cookies, but we are in proxy. And what I mean by that is if they all of a sudden go, everyone that uses Chrome tomorrow is going to get an alert in their browser, a big box that says, would you like to be tracked or not? The same thing that happened with ATT is going to happen here. 90% of folks are going to say, no, I don't want to be tracked. And that will be a sort of de facto opt-in to the Privacy Sandbox APIs, and therefore a de facto death of third-party cookies. I'm calling this the consent cliff. The idea that they're similar to if there was a raw one day cut over from we're going to have all these cookies, all these third-party cookies to no cookies at all. That would be a big cliff. I think it's possible we see the same thing here if they take that mechanism. But that's what I think we have to watch for: is what is the mechanism by which users can opt out? Is there going to be language in front of this? I think what is different about ATT was a policy that had to be interpreted. So you saw a lot of apps maybe frame it differently. Some of them were like, we have to use the exact language that Apple's providing us, and the opt-out has to persist across all these other devices. Is it going to persist across somebody's Google account? Is it going to persist across their mobile device and their desktop device? I think these are all the sort of the macro unknowns about this. I mean, do you have any other thoughts on sort of how it's akin to ATT here?
No, I mean, that to me, I think was like the biggest thing is just like giving that control back to that user in the marketing ploy that we just like talked about from the brand standpoint. But I think one thing that you just mentioned, which I had a question on, which I want to go back to, is what does this actually mean for brands and for advertisers? So you mentioned that already 30 to 40% of people are opting out of cookies on Chrome. There's been this whole push and like this whole, don't want to say fear mongering, but a little bit of fear mongering about like,
it's absolutely fear mongering. Yeah.
But if there's already this deprecation that's been happening on Apple, on Safari, and we already have a lot of people opted out on Chrome, what does this actually mean in terms of addressability and durability in terms of advertising?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and I think Eric Seufert framed it up fairly well. Gosh, I think maybe January of this year, where he talked about there's a very narrow group that this actually applies to, and it really is certain DSPs have an outsized impact here. I think one of the big misunderstandings about third-party cookies, and frankly the reason why I fundamentally disdain the phrase cookie apocalypse or cookieless future, is because those aren't real. That's not a real scenario. There's no world in which we are going to go and live without cookies. And the reason I say this is because the difference between first and third-party cookies is ginormous. A third-party cookie is it's like you're on the Truman Show and there's a camera following you everywhere you go, inside of a store, outside of the store, at home, in the bathroom, everywhere you go. A first-party cookie is just if you walk into a store and there's a security camera, it can follow you around in that environment, but it can't follow you out of it. And also, first-party cookies are used for the backbone of the internet, right? They are used for things like storing products that you've added to your cart on a website. So the fundamentals of e-commerce, or the fundamentals of how we use the internet, would actually break if we got rid of first-party cookies. And I bring that up because there's a lot of confusion around Meta, Facebook. They use a third-party cookie, and the answer to that is no. They use a first-party cookie placed by a third-party script. And I know that can be a confusing construct for folks, but the idea here is that cookie is only going on that one domain, and yes, it's transmitting that data back to Facebook, but it's not following you around the internet beyond there. So when you extrapolate this out, you go, okay, so there's actually no effect on the loss or the ability to maintain third-party cookies on search, social, Amazon, really any of these walled garden environments, right? Now, where it does have an effect is going to be across the open web. And so I say Amazon there in the broadest terms, but there's a small little bit of Amazon when we think about that open web DSP component, where we think about the Criteos of the world and these other ones. And the piece of this that I think is difficult to land on in terms of the effect that we think we'll see is really, are we going to see a consent cliff? Or is this going to be a slow roll? Because one of the inherent challenges that Google have right now with the Privacy Sandbox API set is their performance. And I say this because the privacy sandbox has been testing for quite some time at this point. But there was a report recently that said there are two major issues with the privacy sandbox APIs. The first one is latency, and that is the ability for that signal to be resolved in the auction in a timely manner and therefore serve the appropriate ad. That, of course, is a major issue in digital advertising inventory abilities to serve. The second issue is the accuracy. And we know that the deterministic identity, when that can be resolved, you can say, I've got a one-to-one match here, this is the individual I want to target, this is the product I'm interested in, you should have decent efficiency there, or at least you're at least reaching your target audience, even if they aren't necessarily engaging with that advertising experience. If either of those are inefficient to a degree that it disables the ability of an ad to serve correctly or is mistargeting an individual, what is the effectiveness of that media will diminish. And when media effectiveness diminishes, what naturally happens in the auction is you see a degree of CPM depression. And so that's what they have seen in the early sandbox testing, is about a 33% depression in CPM. So this is a really big deal for publishers in particular. Some advertisers may hear that and go, oh, great, media on a discount. And you're like, yeah, but media on a discount to the wrong audience is, I'd rather have that money back in my pocket in totality. The wasted impressions are a very big problem, and this is how we've evolved to the point we have with the modern web. This ability to have deterministic targeting allowed for the media prices to meet that moment, to allow publishers to exist. And so if these APIs don't improve to at least parity with cookies, what you may encounter is an environment where we just get a whole bunch more MFA websites because they have to try and make up the inventory. Or you get an environment where only the major data players like the New York Times and these huge publications that have logged in data, that have all these deterministic signals that they can leverage in addition to these APIs, where they will be advantaged over the smaller players. Just I guess the broadest thought here in terms of what does it mean for advertisers, I think what it really means is you really need to continue thinking about how are we diversifying our media, how are we ensuring that we're not over-investing in one bucket. Two, you need to know what your identity chains look like. So where are you getting identity from? What are you using to buy in certain environments? Today we're talking a lot about third-party cookies. But the elephant in the room right now is, what about IP addresses? IP addresses are this incredible tool that we have for targeting on CTV and all these other ecosystems. It's a key component of UID 2.0. It is very fragile. And we're already seeing signs from Safari and so Apple in general, like with Private Relay. Right now, it's only in iCloud, so you can only have it if you subscribe. And that's because there's a server cost associated with it. But that, as we look at the components that go into targeting with IP, is very fragile, and they could truncate those. So as that happens, thinking about these durable IDs is going to be really critical. I don't quite know exactly what is going to happen for advertisers as we go through this. It will depend on multiple factors, but you're a core practitioner here. What do you think is going to happen?
It's a good question. It's interesting. I think in some of the conversations I've been having with advertisers, I think there's a couple different things. One is, I think a lot of the advertisers are really just trying to think, did I just waste all the last year and a half getting ready for privacy sandbox and cookie deprecation? Yeah. Is that gone to waste? And I think to what you were just mentioning with making sure you have durable signals and just thinking about the ID graphs and different things that you're looking at, I would say hold true to that. I think that's really going to be like the big thing going forward.
And if I can just add to that for one moment, because there are three components here that I want everyone to keep in mind. The first one is first-party cookies. I talked about how important they are. Yes, very important. Those are already being truncated down to 7 days within Safari. So that's a really important piece of this to keep in mind too. You've only got a 7-day window to maintain that addressability. The second thing is link decoration obfuscation, which means the stripping of the parameters like the Google Click ID or the Facebook Click ID from URLs. Those are also that deterministic signal being stripped away. And then the third one is IP address truncation that we've just been speaking to as well. So to your exact point there of just, has everything been a waste of time? I would unabashedly say no, it has not been a waste of time. It is still incredibly important that we are focused in here. I would also question the degree to which all of them have been testing the privacy sandbox, because I have not seen that. I've had conversations about it, but it's I don't know, everyone's wondering what everyone else is doing. The answer is not much. And so all of that is to say, there is absolutely still that need.
Listen, you hit it right on the head. I've heard that in a couple of conversations so far this week, and I'm just like, no, but we still have to stay the course. To what you were just mentioning with the cookies falling off a cliff, or is it like this slow roll? To me, I think that cookies are going to deprecate for me, I think it's probably going to end up being a slow roll. So I think
Yeah.
what it has done is allowed advertisers and brands who maybe have not been testing out Privacy Sandbox, like you were just
Yeah.
mentioning, to start rolling that out. But then hopefully this is also that catalyst for them to start even thinking about the larger things like you were just mentioning. What about if IP addresses go away?
Yeah.
We also haven't really even talked about the things that are going on from a government standpoint. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening if more states or even like the federal government steps in and says, hey, like we want to maybe potentially do something a little bit more like GDPR. That's
Yeah.
quite
Well,
extreme, but there is potentially the opportunity for something like that to actually come to fruition.
absolutely. And for anyone who was reading the paid media newsletter update 2 weeks ago, I covered the federal level potential approach here. Look, the reality is I probably don't even want to think or talk about that until after November 5th. I think we'll have a better idea of if that is even viable following the election. But certainly to your point, at the regional level, 13 states are already on board with regional or state level privacy laws. That is only going to proliferate and continue. I even saw the FTC today talking about how hashed emails are not an anonymized signal, which is interesting given that you cannot reverse hashing. So I struggle with that one a little bit. I appreciate why they think it is, but it's also, I guess, it is fundamentally anonymized in that capacity.
I also want to get your take on that because that has been a lot of the conversation that we have about hashing emails for so long. When something like this comes up, to our clients who may not necessarily be in the engineering space or really understand what that actually means, can you give a little bit of an overview of just the FTC actually came out and said if that actually has any implication for things that we're doing today?
Hashing is fundamentally mathematical computation that if I put in a certain set of characters, that there will be a mathematical computation that creates a hashed ID or a hash code that is able to then be matched in a system if that email gets hashed again. But I cannot reverse that process. The amount of compute required to do that just doesn't exist. I saw some calculation a while ago that it would take 1,000,000 years, all the computers in the world working for 1,000,000 years to reverse a hash. So that's it's a one-directional process. When we talk about hashing, I think we're really talking about it through the lens of secure data transmission and the idea that, look, even if this signal were to get intercepted in this journey where it's being sent from a website to an advertising platform, it's not identifiable, right? I can't de-anonymize that in any capacity. I can't hijack someone's email through that process. So there's a security component to this. The big piece of this is ultimately, do you have consent to do? Because when we talk about individual identifiers, PII, what is trade is called DII, directly identifiable. But when we talk about those, IP is one, email is one. It does stand to reason that a hashed ID would be one too, because it's going to be consistent every single time. So that is something that is very important to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, it does come down to consent. I think that is at the core of everything, and that is building out a process and methodology by which to both enable consent, and even if it's not legally required of you, acknowledging where the puck is going at this moment in time is one where folks do want consent. Whether or not folks want a banner on every single website to ask them if they want cookies or not is debatable, but cookies are not the be-all and end-all of identification of things that users would need to consent to. And I think there is a broader degree and broader need across the industry for that to be a standard that we all do adopt.
I think so. One of the other conversations that I've been having recently as well, which I'd like to get your take on, is just like the impact that the cookie deprecation or lack thereof from a Google standpoint has on other platforms. So like we talked a little bit a couple minutes ago about first party cookies are still there. You still have these walled gardens, but there's been some conversation about, once cookie deprecation would happen from a Google standpoint, we would potentially see advertisers moving out of Google and into an Amazon. I don't really subscribe to that, but I'm curious to get like your thoughts if you've heard of anybody talking in that sense.
So I'll tell you why I don't subscribe to it as well, and that is Google was going to enable, or is going to enable, the Privacy Sandbox. It doesn't mean Google's going to use the Privacy Sandbox. Google is unto itself still a walled garden. I talked about search. I should have talked about YouTube. That is also within the walled garden of Google, right? This idea that Google owns the rails, Google owns Google Maps, YouTube, Gmail, all these places where you are likely to be signed in. Android, they have all these signals. That was part of the UKCMA's rallying against Google, saying you're creating a two-tier system, one for you, one for them. And so it really was the small DSPs that were going to suffer as a result of this. I think one of the smart plays is to acknowledge the fact that Facebook or Meta and some others have already weathered the storm with the ATT push, in that they've already made a really big investment, a really big bet on moving toward modeled IDs, modeled performance data. And there was a while after the ATT push where we did see performance within the Meta environment. It tanked a little bit. It didn't look great for a little while. They have improved significantly. They are able to do a lot more with a lot less data because of the utility they have with modeling. This does mean that there are delays in the signals getting through within their platform sometimes, but there was a period where you had to, have your conversions structured and have them prioritized, and we need 1,000 conversions here, and all of that is diminishing over time. It's the same reason why in Google we see the DDA threshold has decreased over time. It's because they're modeling that much better. They're modeling that much more accurately. So in terms of what would happen with the other platforms, I think there may have been a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction towards saying, oh, we should go into spend more money on Meta because we're more confident within this walled garden environment. I don't think that is necessarily the case here, because there is also just, they don't have all of the audience in the world. And so my recommendation would still be keep the faith in terms of having a diversified media profile. I think it's like looking at stocks, right? Think about this through the lens of ETFs and not individual stocks. Don't go all in on one platform or you might lose your shit. There's a chance you bet on the right platform and you're like, we were on TikTok on day one and we have all that, and you're like, that's great for you. But that was highly risky. That could have absolutely not worked out for you. It could have been like a Pinterest play or something, right? Like that only hit a sort of very low level of maturity, and that's where it's going to stay. So all of this is through the lens of how will these other DSPs operate in this capacity. And I do think, if anything, we'll see a greater degree of UID 2.0 adoption. I think we're already seeing Walmart leaning in there, the fact that they've got Vizio. RMNs they are so poised to grow at this moment in time. The fact that they have all of this, not just identity, but behavioral purchase transaction data, it's a goldmine. And that's why we're only I think we're in the second innings of RMNs right now. I think we're going to see, I don't know, that industry is going to blow up 4 or 5 times what it is right now. And then they'll go through a consolidation cycle. It's the sort of the Martech ad tech pendulum. It always goes through Cambrian explosions and then solidification. This moment in time, though, is somewhat of a status quo. And I know Criteo stock went all the way up just yesterday because everyone's like, hooray! And I'm like, that's a pretty naive view of this. This is a short-term stay. You don't know what the consent mechanism is going to be. And frankly, the bet still has to be on what happens a year or 2 years from now, because this does not mean that cookies have been, third-party cookies are not going to be deprecated. It just means that it's probably going to extend the timeline a couple of years. So it's going to be interesting. Yeah.
I think the diversification is a really good point and a very strong point, because at the end of the day, you also have to think about not everybody is just on Google. They're also on Meta. They're also on streaming. They're also on Amazon.
Yes.
Like, in order to effectively target your audience, now whether you could address them in a one-to-one manner across all these different platforms is a different topic, but you need to make sure that you're there and you're engaging with that consumer, because that user journey is not necessarily a funnel anymore. Like,
absolutely,
we have people who continue to go through this exploration and evaluation phase, which is also why you mentioned RMMs. I'm also very bullish on the RM and just like digital out of home in general. It's just another element that really leans into engaging that audience throughout their entire day, whether they're on their phone or on their TV or just like out in the real world. There's definitely this convergence that's happening. So I think being diversified and really thinking about all the different elements and how you want to engage your audience, and that's what it comes back down to me. Is just think audience first. You talked about it earlier today, the identity graph, and trying to lean in to who your consumer is really going to be the approach. And I think that's really what's going to drive business impact long term.
Absolutely. All right. Hey, until we hear back from Google as to what is exactly going to happen with this informed consent option, this has been fun.
Likewise, awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Simon.
Cheers, Brian.